Hello, my name is Jackson Gortney, and I'm going to be doing my psychology presentation, which I just called Psychology 200 Reflection. The first thing is the article, which was on violence in the media. So I got a little word, so I'm just going to read. So on research on violent behavior, I wrote, the book tells us that our sensory receptors take in sensory information from our environment. In this case, that would be the violent media. But it is ultimately up to how we interpret that information to determine the effects. And that's the general consensus among most people and people who have done research into this. However, there is evidence from 217 studies from 1957 to 1990, as well as 42 additional studies with 5,000 participants that attempt to correlate violent media with violent behavior. And as I'm going to say in the next part, there was a lot of um, popular uh, research into the effects of violent media on violent behavior, but there wasn't anything concrete really found to show that kids who were consuming violent media were actually being caused to act aggressively by it. And the studies from 57 to 90 found that short-term effect of exposure to media violence on actual physical violence against a person was moderate in strength. 200 studies also found a moderate positive relationship between violent media and actual physical aggression. An association with antisocial behaviors was also found. None of the research is concrete enough. Now, when you actually read the research, it does talk about how there were kids who they found in the research that consumed a lot of violent media that acted antisocially or tended to be aggressive physically, but they didn't seem to watch enough of it to actually warrant, um, or they weren't being aggressive enough to actually have it matter, really. There were just a lot of technicalities that got in the way of being able to find an actual connection between the two things. And in the discussion, we talked about how attention, motivation, and sensory adaptation influence perception. And those are all brain functions that are really the things that come together and make us react to something like violent media in the way that we would. And those fully just our brain doing that, not the media. These are the functions of our brain that determine whether or not and to what extent we are affected by the media we see. The article says the absence of evidence of a causative link is not evidence of its absence. Basically, just meaning that they still have hope that there is evidence to find in this research. They believe that violent media is dangerous, and they want to find the effects of it on children. So for the first podcast on psychological disorders, I chose borderline personality disorder. And what is that? Well, a psychological disorder is a mental disorder that um, seems mild. It's pretty, the people are high functioning. They just seem maybe they could be a little depressive or anxious, but it does come with some psychotic effects under stress or highly intense situations. Uh, with BPD, unstable and intense mood and behavior, chaotic and unstable relationships, trouble functioning in the outside world, and an unhealthy view of oneself, among others, are the effects. How the disorder affects others. People with BPD can't handle being alone. They latch onto relationships, which often go bad because of their illness. A romantic partner of someone with BPD may feel intensely loved and worshipped at first, but as time goes on, they start to scrutinize and become worked up by any small or non-existent sign of disinterest. So this means that um, at the beginning of a relationship, it might feel really good to be dating this person who has bipolar disorder, but you may notice as it goes along that any little thing that you do could be fodder for them to yell at you and could make them upset, even if it was something as small as, shutting the wrong door. They would take that as a personal attack. Um, the women who run the podcast that I listen to for this topic, they have a mother with bipolar disorder, and they described how much it strained their relationship. They didn't want to be around their mother often and had to change their behavior in order to not set her off whenever they were around her. And this is another thing that this is another way that the disorder affects people who don't have it, um, because they consciously start to alter themselves and change the way that they act and the things that they say around that person in order to not set them off. And that can just be really mentally tiring and to have to check yourself like that, even to just talk to somebody. Uh, what causes this disorder? Both our book and this podcast say there's a large genetic component, which is also just a general idea and like a common theory. The rates of bipolar disorder among individuals with family members who also have it has been found to be as high as 24.9%. Many sufferers also have experienced traumatizing events in the past, so it is believed that a coupling of these factors leads to BPD. A lot of mental disorders can be caused and stoked by trauma. And in the case of bipolar disorder, it is believed that significant trauma can actually be so effective that it causes the disorder. For the second podcast, which was about stress, I did the Now for Tomorrow podcast with Deepak Chopra. What is stress? There are many different definitions for stress, and they are based on different factors. Something could be stressful for one person and not at all for another. A useful way to conceptualize stress is to view it as a process whereby an individual perceives and responds to events that they appraise as overwhelming or threatening to their well-being. And that is the direct quote or definition from our textbook. This podcast episode describes stress as a reaction to imbalances in mental needs and priorities. And what I mean by imbalances in mental needs, I mean like um, maybe if you didn't personally feel that you were being social enough or you didn't feel like you were doing well enough in school, uh, it's not really a balance of something definite. It's just you have your own mental gauge for where you need to be at. And if you're below or under that, that can be very stressful. Some common stressors are stuff like relationships, school, work, change, trauma, or health. Health is a very big one for people. And all of these things just when they are thought about and how unstable and hard to keep track of they are, it can cause our bodies to have the reaction of stress. The textbook says that stressors are things slash events that we assess as threatening. This assessment influences how we react. Coping with stress, both this podcast and the textbook emphasize the idea that many tools for dealing with and regulating stress are innate inside of us. Coping strategies is the premise for this podcast episode, so it says more than the book, but the general idea is that things such as breathing, physical outlets, mantras, and other mental practices can be just as effective at minimizing stress. And what I mean by physical outlets, I mean like maybe, squeezing your thumb, or my mom always told me if I ever was getting nervous to pinch the seam of my jeans, just little things like that. And mantras, just telling yourself that you're okay, telling yourself any specific thing that you personally need to affirm yourself of. And then other mental practices are just like trying to regulate those stressful thoughts. The third podcast was about a treatment for psychological disorders, and I chose hallucinogenic therapy, which is a pretty abnormal type of therapy. A pretty big part of the course material this semester involves psychological disorders, which affect the brain functions in emotional and functional areas of the brain, and they cause abnormalities in a person's thought, behavior, and ability to participate regularly in the world. These disorders encompass many things from from general anxiety to serious illnesses with often dangerous psychotic effects. So some of the illnesses that would probably be treated by this type of therapy would be bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, PTSD, and OCD. Um, the Some other types of treatment are just general therapy, talk therapy. Uh, Here I wrote a lot about how mental health practices used to be very bad for people, and many things were done to them: exorcisms, torture. They were put in jail. They were burned at the stake. Just people thought that they were possessed by demons, or that they were witches or made a pact with the devil, and that was the reason they were acting the way that they were. When really it was just the effects of their disorder. This podcast, like I said, talks about hallucinogenic therapy. And then I wrote, for this topic, I chose to listen to a podcast on hallucinogenic drug therapy. The basic idea is that since the primary function of hallucinogens is to alter the way that neurons and neurotransmitters communicate with the sensory areas of the brain to alter our state of mind, there may be positive results in doctor-administered doses of drugs like LSD and psilocybin because they could offset the effects of mental disorders on some of the same areas of the brain. So basically, what I said there is that the some of these mental disorders um, affect the same areas of the brain and cause some of the same things to happen in the body and brain relationship as these drugs do. And it's the people doing this kind of therapy believe that there can be positive results from giving patients these drugs and seeing how the drug effects react with the disorder effects. And if there is a possible way to offset those, um, it's a kind of a hard thing to regulate. It really is kind of just like trying to defibrillate somebody's neurotransmitters. But there have been people who vouch for the practice, and people um, alike who have said that it's not effective at all. So it's a new practice, and we really don't know much about it yet. but there are people on both sides. And for the summary, for the first article I just wrote, though there has been significant research into the effects of violent media on aggression and viewers and a link has been found, there is no concrete evidence that says violence on screen causes violence in real life. For the second podcast, for the first podcast I wrote, as of 2022, 20% of Americans suffer from psychological disorders, and the effects of these disorders can cause people to behave aggressively. BPD affects over 5 million people in the US alone. It affects the brain in such a way that causes sufferers' relationships and emotions to be chaotic, often leading to people wanting to distance themselves from them. Podcast 2, stress and the accompanying symptoms are our body's response to something we perceive as threatening. The definition is vague because we are so different and can be stressed out or not be very different. Sorry. The definition is so vague because we are so different and can be stressed out or not by very different things. Common stressors include work, school, money, health, and trauma. One is often able to cope with stress through practices that can be done anytime they need to be done, such as breathing exercises, mantras, physical outlets, and attempting to regulate your thoughts. In the third podcast, treatment for mentally ill people was very bad for a long time and had lasting negative effects in the community. Today, we have a variety of ethical mental health and practices, and new ones are being developed all the time. One type is hallucinogenic drug therapy, which seeks to counteract the dysfunctions of the nervous system caused by psychological disorders with the effects of hallucinogenic drugs that target some of the same areas of the brain. And here's my reference page. Thank you. That's all I have.